If God is sovereign over everything, and He is, then do we have any true responsibility? I mean, since God's providence reigns supreme, why do we even have to act? Well, those are great questions, and my name is Peter Finch, and we are going to answer some of those questions and others today on Beyond the Notes. This past Lord's Day, we talked about chapter 4 of the book of Esther. And as we go through this book, we have mentioned a couple things. One is that the name of God does not appear whatsoever in this book, whether directly or even as a pronoun. But in spite of that, we've also mentioned that the providence of God, His hand of sovereignty over human events, is clearly seen on every single page of Scripture. And we saw part of that in chapter 4. And I want to reread one of the paragraphs that we didn't have time to explain fully in the sermon this past Sunday. And that's in chapter 4, verses 12 through 14. And this is Mordecai answering Esther. And he says that they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" So in these few verses, Mordecai is reiterating what we already know to be true about the book of Esther, that God is provident. He is sovereign over the affairs of humankind. And he even specifically says that God will bring relief and deliverance. So from these few verses, I think a couple things that Mordecai is reminding us about God's providence. And first is that God has divine purposes to accomplish in this world. God's purposes involve the Jewish nation, as we see here in Esther, and it also involves the Gentile nations of the world. They also involve the church. God deals with individuals, and He deals with entire nations. His purposes touch the lives of kings and queens and common people, godly people and wicked people. There is nothing in this universe that is outside of God's sovereignty and His purposes. I think we also see another important principle about God's providence in that God accomplishes His purposes through people. And although we don't fully understand His reasoning, God permits wicked people to do evil things in this world. And it's incredible to think how God can receive glory from that. And sometimes we see those evidences, but sometimes we don't. And we have to simply trust that God is sovereign and He is using all things for His glory and for our good. And God can work in and through both unbelievers and His own people. We see that in the book of Esther time and time again. And while He is not the author of King Ahasuerus' sin, God uses his drunkenness and foolishness to dispose of Queen Vashti. And we saw that God used his loneliness later on to search for and find and put into place Esther as the new queen. And if you read ahead, God is going to use the king's sleeplessness to remind him of what Mordecai has done, and to start that process of honoring Mordecai and the soon defeat of Haman. Over and over again, God will use people to accomplish His purposes. Not necessarily good people. He can use bad ones as well. And what we also see here, and this is what Mordecai is really hinting at and encouraging Esther as a reason, a motivation for her interceding for her people, is that God will accomplish His purposes even if His servants refuse to obey His will. We saw that with Esther and Mordecai saying, if you do not rise to the occasion, if you keep silent, God will deliver His people somehow. So God was not relying on Esther. God used Esther, and because she was obedient, she received blessing due to her obedience. When you and I refuse to obey God's revealed will for our lives, when there is something that he either speaks clearly from his word to tell us, or we feel that he is leading us to do something, if we refuse to obey, our disobedience will not thwart God's purposes or his will. But rather, usually God will do one of two things, and he can do more than one of these two things, but often he will either set aside our disobedience and find somebody else to do his work. And when we disobey, we suffer the consequences of lack of blessing and maybe other serious consequences in life. We saw that with John Mark. When John Mark was accompanying Paul and Barnabas on their missionary journey, and he abandoned them. Well, God raised up Timothy in the future to accompany Paul on different mission trips. So sometimes God will put aside an individual who does not want to participate in God's work, and he'll raise somebody else up to accomplish his purpose. Other times, God will lovingly discipline his servants until they get to the point where they surrender to his will. We see that in the example of Jonah. Jonah at first did not want to follow God's will to go to Nineveh. He was completely opposed to that idea. But through his loving discipline, God helped Jonah see that he was indeed in control over everything, including Jonah's own life. At the end, Jonah surrendered to God's will and accomplished it. You see, the providence of God does not put aside or relieve us of our human responsibility. God's providence doesn't call for inactivity. On the contrary, it calls for activity. And God uses frail vessels like Mordecai and Esther, like you and like me, to accomplish his purposes. And just as God sovereignly determines the end that he is going to accomplish, God will also determine the means by which he accomplishes that end. And many, many, many times, the means that God sovereignly appoints, it's us. God uses his people. It's the same kind of mystery, how God is sovereign over everything. He's omnipotent. He does everything according to his own will, and yet God chooses to listen to the prayers of his children. It's not as if we determine God's will by how we pray, but God allows us to participate in what he is doing in his work, because he has already sovereignly determined the end, but he has also determined the means by which he will come to that end, and often that means are the prayers of his children. Likewise, as we understand God's providence, how he moves in our lives, he orchestrates details in the minute details of our lives to come to the point where he tells us what to do. We see what he is doing. It doesn't mean that we are free from activity because God sovereignly arranges everything. No, on the contrary, we are free to enjoy participating in what God is doing. And we see that Esther realized that at the end, and she rose to the occasion, not because she had something to gain for herself, but she realized, this is what God has called me to do. You know, Romans 8:28 is still true, that all things, both great things and small things, they do work together for good to those who love God and who are called according to his purposes. And as I think about that verse, and about God's providence, it reminds me of two things. One, this gives me confidence. It gives me confidence to know that God is in control over every aspect of my life. It gives me confidence that even when bad things happen in my life, I know that God sees it. I know that he cares. I know that he has, for some reason, allowed this to happen or caused it to happen so that I would be drawn closer to him, that somehow that I would be able to bring him glory even through suffering in my life. So number one, it gives me confidence. But second, it gives me courage. It gives me boldness, because if I know, and since I know that God is sovereign over my life, and I can see his providence working in the details of my life, it gives me boldness to be able to share with others, not fearing what they might do or how they might act, but knowing that this is what God has called me to do. And if he has saved me the way he has, it gives me a passion to share the gospel with others, because God is in control. God is sovereign. In the same way that he's sovereign over who will come to Christ, who will be saved, he is sovereign in the means, once again, by which those people will be saved, and that is by the preaching of the gospel through his people. In 1932, a man named A.M. Overton wrote a poem. I believe he actually wrote it at his wife's funeral. And the poem is called "He Maketh No Mistake." It is from the 1930s, so the language is sort of 1930s-ish. But I think the message is very clear. The poem says this: "My Father's way may twist and turn. His heart may throb, my heart may throb and ache. But in my soul I'm glad to know He maketh no mistake. My cherished plans may go astray. My hopes may fade away. But still I'll trust my Lord to lead, for He doth know the way. Though night be dark, and it may seem that day will never break, I'll pin my faith, my all in Him. He maketh no mistake. There's so much now I cannot see, my eyesight's far too dim. But come what may, I'll simply trust, and leave it all to Him. For by and by the mist will lift, and plain it all He'll make. Through all the way, though dark to me, He made not one mistake." We know that God is in control. We know He is sovereign. And part of His sovereignty allows us to simply trust it all to Him. Even though sorrow and strife and conflict, sometimes anxieties, are a part of this human experience, we can know that God makes not a single mistake. And everything that He does in your life and in mine is for a purpose. It's for ultimately His glory. And as He receives glory, it is also for our good. He allows us to grow closer to Him. He allows us to experience His grace in a brand new way. So when you don't understand what's going on in your life, and join the club, I pray that we would look to Him and see God's providence at work in our lives and realize that He is worth following. He is worth trusting with our all. He says, "I'll pin my faith, my all in Him, for He maketh no mistake." As we continue the next several weeks in this book of Esther, I encourage you to read ahead. And as we continue to see God's providence over and over again, working in Esther's life, in Mordecai's life, in the Jews' lives, and by application in our lives as well. We look forward to seeing you in the Sundays to come, and also next time here on Beyond the Notes.